Hello and welcome everyone to this webinar to discuss the Pension Protection Fund's annual Purple Book, a webinar we're delighted to be holding in conjunction with the PPF. My name's Jonathan Stapleton, I'm the editor of PP and I'll be your host for this session. The PPF's annual Purple Book, as many of you know, provides a comprehensive picture of the DB pensions landscape in the UK. And this webinar, accompanying the launch of this year's edition, will provide insights on key trends and emerging themes around scheme funding, demographics and evolving asset allocation. It will also touch on how data updates and valuation timing continue to shape the broader picture. It will give you a chance to put your questions to our panelists from the PPF, and I'm delighted to welcome our two speakers today. We have PPF Chief Actuary Shalin Bhagwan and PPF Actuary James Emmott. So welcome to both of you. Before I hand over to James and Shalin to introduce themselves and to present some of the highlights of this year's Purple Book, I'd just like to remind you that if you have a question to put to our speakers, please just type it into the chat and I will get through as many of those in the Q&A session after the presentations. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to you, James. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Good morning, everyone, and thank you to Professional Pensions for having us back once again. As Jonathan said, my name's James Emmott. I'm an actuary here at the PPF, going on just about 8 years now. I've been involved in Purple on and off over those 8 years, having led on it for the last 3. Shalin.
Thank you. Apologies for the slight pause. We were going through a fire alarm. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning on the 20th anniversary of Purple Book 2025, 20 years since the first publication of Purple. My name is Shalin Bhagwan. I'm the Chief Actuary here at the Pension Protection Fund. Just like to draw your attention to the fact that the Purple Book 2025 is now live. It has dropped, and I'm sure it's going to make its way to the top of your reading list this weekend, and I'm sure there will be something in it for everyone. Over the next 20 to 25 minutes, James and I will pick out some highlights from Purple 2025, and I would encourage you to also look out for our LinkedIn posts in the coming weeks as some of our actuarial team pick out their own particular observation on Purple 2025. Next slide, please. So this has been our 20th year of publishing what we call the Pension Universe Risk Profile, which you may or may not be aware is the unabbreviated name for Purple. It gives us at the PPF a lens on the risk that we face from the DB pensions universe. It's also our first publication since we announced our move to a zero levy, a move made possible by our current reserves of just north of £14 billion, but as importantly, a move made sustainable by the fact that those reserves continue to be the subject of our prudent stewardship. And it's quite important that we recognize that those reserves are needed to continue to navigate the current DB universe, because as Purple 2025 tells us, whilst the aggregate funding position of the defined benefit universe looks rosy, if we drill down beyond the aggregate numbers, there are some risks that still remain in the universe. As an example, roughly 1,200 schemes are still in deficit, and that on a Section 179 basis. Almost 2/3 of schemes, or 3,200 of the roughly 5,000 schemes we serve to protect, are on deficit on a buyout basis to the tune of some £127 billion. The PPF serves as an important backstop for those pension fund trustees and sponsors still running on with a view to closing those deficits, either to reach full funding on a buyout basis or alternatively their chosen measure of self-sufficiency. So we're here to protect those 5,000 schemes and their 8.6 million members. By tracking trends in funding, demographics, and asset allocation, The Purple Book gives the PPF a window into the risks we face from these schemes. And in this, the year in which we move to a zero levy, it's perhaps worth pausing to reflect on the evolution of Purple and just how sophisticated our view on the data is today compared to those early days when, in fact, in our very first year, our levy was set purely by membership numbers, and it was only in our second year that we moved to a risk-based levy. Finally, Purple is the starting point for the creation of the PPF 7800, the official national statistic and our monthly update of the universe's assets and liabilities that we publish on our website. And again, another interesting anecdote, back in the very first year of our existence, that number of the estimate in terms of the number of schemes we protected was thought to be 10,800 and only subsequently revised down to the more readily recognizable number we see today of 7,800. Next slide, please. So James will run through some of the data behind the Purple Book, talk a bit about the profile of the universe in terms of scheme status as well as funding and asset allocation. And we'll close with a few Easter eggs, despite it being Christmas, with what else is new in Purple, because we do have some exciting new analyses that we've included, and we hope that this will be of interest to all of you. Next slide, please. The two key words to take away from this year's Purple Book are stability and consistency. Whether you're looking at the aggregate surplus on a Section 179 basis, or indeed the proportion of open schemes or asset allocation across growth assets such as equities or bonds, the picture is one of stability and consistency between last year and this year. And that's further highlighted on the next slide, where if you look at the PPF 7800, our estimate of what the March 2025 figures could look like, and the actual Purple Book 2025 figures based on updated scheme return data, again, that picture of consistency and stability comes through in terms of funding ratios being relatively stable and consistent, the value of scheme assets, or indeed the aggregate surplus in the universe. But we're humble enough to accept that this is made possible by the stable market environment that we've been faced with on a relative basis this year versus previous years. It's also a reflection of the fact that pension funds themselves have reached a degree of stability in their funding and asset allocation approaches. Next slide, please. Finally, before I hand over to James, perhaps just to draw out three key things that has changed over the course of Purple 2025. Firstly, where previously we were estimating the deficit of schemes in deficit to be roughly £30 billion based on the roll forward methodology, that number is back down to £22 billion. The annuity proportion is the highest it's ever been at 13%, the previous high being just shy of 10%. So a significant increase in the amount of annuities being held by schemes, perhaps a reflection of the fact that more schemes are conducting buy-in transactions in preparation for buyout. And finally, the estimated deficit on a buyout basis in aggregate is down at 47 billion from 70 billion last year. But again, I'd caution that that is the aggregate deficit. And as we know, the aggregate average is distorted by the fact that if you were to drill down deeper, then focus purely on the schemes that are actually in deficit, that number rises to 127 billion pounds. So not out of the woods yet, a consistent and stable universe, and the PPF continuing to exist to protect 8.6 million members across some 5,000 defined benefit pension funds. And with that, I will hand over to James.
Thank you very much, Shalin. I will start, if I may, with my usual but important reminder of the data behind the Purple Book. Purple Book is a roll forward. The figures as at 31st of March 2025, rolled forward from Section 179 valuations submitted in the scheme returns to the pensions regulator. These are on average 2 years old, many are older than that. Supplemented with asset allocation information, which does tend to be younger than the Section 179s because those come out of schemes' annual report and accounts. In terms of what that data has ended up as, we are at 4,840 schemes in the estimated eligible universe in 2025. And while that's only a sort of 2.5% decline since the previous year, and I suppose it would take 40 years or more to trend to zero at that rate, it is actually the single largest absolute figure decrease in schemes since 2017, 2018, something like that, at the 134 difference since last year. And within those schemes are 8.6 million members, 700,000 of whom are active members still accruing benefits, and that 700k is very similar to last year's, which rounded to the same 700k. Next slide, please, Sophie. Shalin mentioned some new stuff, some new content that we have added into Purple this year. Here is an example of that from the data chapter 2 in Purple Book, and it is more of a granular reconciliation in where those schemes have gone from the Purple data set over the year. I won't go through every row, number, column in this slide because you will do that at your leisure with a cup of tea and a mince pie, perhaps over the weekend, looking at the Purple Book. But just to draw out an example of something here, we see that the number of schemes bought out was around 80 over the year. That number might be smaller than you might expect, but that is just buyouts that leave the universe completely. It doesn't have any other types of risk transfers in it, like buy-ins, which would stay in the PPF universe. With those 80 schemes, around 4 billion liabilities removed, and for every £1 billion removed, it took £500 million of surplus with it. Next slide, please, Sophie. Okay, this next section about the scheme demographics, and what I often usually show here is the history, the trend chart from 2006 to now. But because 2025 is so similar to 2024, I thought I would show the pie charts themselves for a change. Lots of pie charts in chapter 3. The top one is the proportion of schemes by scheme status, which shows, for example, that 4% of schemes remain open to new members. That's one of Shalin's highlights a moment ago. And the interesting thing about that is always that while it's only 4% of schemes, if you compare it to the pie chart below, which is the distribution of members by scheme status, you'll see that open schemes have 15% of the members in them because they tend to be larger overall, those schemes. The other statistic I'd like to draw out is that winding up proportion in the top pie chart there, up to 5%. It's not normally that high. It's normally between 1 and 3, perhaps, as schemes are on their way to buyout, to leaving the universe, but haven't quite left it yet. And hence they're still in the data with this winding up status. But as Shalin said earlier, with the annuity proportion being higher, as schemes are buying in, many will be on the way to buyout. Until they complete that journey, they remain in the universe with this status. And so I think those two statistics relate to each other, as we see here. Next slide, please, Sophie. Another pie chart from chapter 3. I said there were lots of pies. This one is the distribution of schemes by asset size. I have added a companion chart to this in the Purple Book this year, just to really sort of hammer home this point about the skewness of the universe and how a small number of large schemes dominate the assets, the liabilities, the membership numbers, but there are a lot of small schemes. For example, the pie chart shows that over 1,000 schemes have assets of under £5 million. My overall statistic is that under 80% of schemes have assets less than 100 million. And what my companion chart shows, a couple of statistics there, are that while the mean asset value of schemes in the universe is 221 million, the median value is only 19. So that really does show that skewness, I think. Next slide, please, Sophie. In terms of scheme funding, we're on section 4 of this webinar, and it's chapter 4 in the Purple Book, so far a one-to-one mapping. But again, one of Shalin's highlights earlier is the overall aggregate section 179 surplus, 214 billion as at 31st of March 25 in the Purple Book. 179, of course, being what would have to be paid to insurers to take on PPF levels of benefit, i.e. not scheme levels, but PPF levels of compensation. And I will note that 214 is the core number calculated and does not allow for any pre-97 indexation impacts. More on that in a moment, but just to say that 214, it does not allow for PPF paying any pre-97 indexation. Behind that, 26% of schemes are in deficit, with a deficit of 22 billion. So, Sophie, next slide, please. And in the context of that 22 billion deficit, the PPF reserves are up to 14 billion pounds. This is again is at 31st of March 2025. This figure's also in our annual report and accounts, as well as Purple Book. So up slightly from up a bit from the year before. Next slide, please, Sophie. And why do we have those reserves? They are there to protect against the risks on us. One risk is the risk of people living longer than anticipated in the modelling, priority one longevity risk in the parlance of our funding strategy, and also the reason we exist, which is to protect against claims, and then also to provide additional protection for our membership over and above that. And then, of course, there are risks on top of these that aren't as sort of quantifiable as we've done for these, such as climate change risk or the risk of future legislative change. So, altogether, our reserves are here to protect against these things, the risk to us now, and over the years and perhaps decades to come of the PPF's life. Next slide, please, Sophie. We've talked a bit about sort of the stability of the Purple Book from 2024 to 25. Markets have moved sort of more since then. In the 6 to 7 months since March, equity markets in particular have moved more than they did in the year to March 25. So what I'm showing here is an update to October 25. We're working on the November figures at the moment, and they will come out next week in the latest 7,800, which gets updated this time every year to take allowance of the new Purple data, but the new Purple 25 data in this case. Excuse me, pardon me. The 15-year fixed interest gilt yields, for example, have declined over the last 6-7 months, leading to an increase in Section 179 liability values and bond assets. But because equity markets and the indices that we use to show that have increased by an awful lot in the last 6 to 7 months, we see assets have gone up by more than liabilities in that time. And so a larger surplus has emerged compared to the similarity in the Purple books. And along with that, of course, the funding ratio has increased, and the deficit of schemes in deficit has decreased slightly to 19 billion in the October figures. And that's across a smaller proportion of schemes, 21% down from 26. Since I mentioned Section 179 liabilities here, that 154 billion, I think now would be a good time to say that in the Purple Book we've included as a sensitivity, and I put it there before the budget, of what the impact of pre-1997 indexation paid by the PPF on Section 179 liabilities could be. And using the illustrative scenario that we've used shows these liabilities to increase by around 12%. I set out in the small print in the purple book what that scenario is. It is an illustration. It isn't necessarily the final criteria that will be used for which schemes get pre-97 and how much. So when you look at Chapter 5, the note is there in the table that explains where I got the number from. And I should also say that this is really about Section 179 liabilities. The impact of this, there is no impact on technical provisions or on buyout measure or on deficit reduction contributions. It really is just this sort of PPF benefit measure. Next slide, please, Sophie. Okay, and this next section, well, Section 5 of the webinar, but it's actually Chapter 7 in the purple book. So my mapping has gone to pot now. I've skipped a couple of chapters, I'm afraid. But yes, this section on asset allocations, and starting with the sort of the overall high level, equities, bonds, other allocation style. What this seems to show is almost like a steady state has been reached. If you look at bonds, the blue bars in the middle, for example, you'll see that it's been around 70% since 2020 with not much variation. Equities, on the other hand, started at 20% 2020, down to 15% in 25, but that 15% is the same, at least once it's rounded, to the 15% last year. And I think it's right not to expect equities will continue trending down to zero, because while there are still large open schemes out there, there will always be equity investment. So I think that stacks up with, again, this idea of some sort of steady state, however long it may last. Next slide, please. Taking it down one level further of granularity, to wit the bonds and equities here. The top chart splits bonds between government fixed interest, index linked, and corporate debt. And for the first time in this chart this year, I've split corporate debt in between public and private debt. That's the stuff that you can see in the top right-hand corner of this slide, the green and pink bars in the middle. Why only from 2023? Well, that was the first year that this granularity was collected in the scheme return. So we can only go back that far. And you can see that the private debt proportion of bonds was 5% in 2023, but that went up to 7% in 24, which has remained so in 25. Turning to equity breakdown, and specifically the bottom right hand of the chart, the last 3 years, we see that the proportion in UK quoted public equity has decreased again from 7% last year to 5% this year, 2025. And then looking at the pink bars there in respect of private equity, I think what we might be seeing there could be called the denominator effect, in which schemes are holding perhaps more private equity assets than they may be targeting relative to public equity, and how that effect persists in what might be a hangover from a significant sale of public market assets during, say, the 2022 gilt market volatility. Next slide, please, Sophie. And one more chart from the asset allocation. I don't think I've shown this on the webinar before, but it shows the average asset allocation of schemes by asset size. Again, lots of numbers and patterns to see here, but one I will highlight, looking at annuities, is that Shalin said earlier, the overall is 13% across the whole universe, but we see that for schemes with less than £1 billion in assets, that number is higher, more than 15 and close to 20% in some cases. So it's those large schemes, those over £1 billion schemes, that with their annuity proportion of just over 10%, is dragging down that overall weighted average. And the other reason I wanted to show this slide, I've even put an unsubtle box around it, is just the quality of life addition of the total assets in each asset size category. Hopefully this will prevent some flicking between the pages needed while perusing the purple book, which I find much harder to do on screen than I do with a printout. But just hopefully such a small change isn't too small to be valuable, and we hope it helps paint a fuller picture of the segmentation of the universe. The next slide, please, Sophie. And then finally, from me, as Shalin alluded to earlier, yes, there is new content in the Purple Book. I've mentioned 2 or 3 things along the way already. What else is there? In Chapter 3, there's an even more granular split out of the types of pre-97 increases that schemes give, about different types of capping and inflation and all the different fixed interest, fixed increases that are given. So you'll find that towards the end of Chapter 3. Chapter 4 includes a breakout analysis of schemes in deficit on estimated full buyout measure. Chapter 4 also includes a table with the estimated running costs by size of scheme, which shows, for example, that smaller schemes could be paying around 4 times more as a proportion of assets than large schemes are on their running costs. And I already mentioned that I included a sensitivity on pre-97 indexation. In the Purple Book, there's a whole new table of sensitivities at the end of the sensitivity chapter, chapter 5. So what we're trying to do here is sort of strike a balance between sort of the core content that people expect and want from Purple in a consistent and comparable form in the same place that it can be found easily from year to year. But we want to keep Purple up to date, continually useful. It's a living, evolving document. So we're always willing to hear feedback and hear inspiration for what other content you might like to see in the Purple Book. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that, James. Thank you, Shalin. Really very much appreciate it. Please do put your questions in the Q&A box, and I will put as many of those to Shalin and James as possible as part of this Q&A. We have one in already. James, it's a question following up one of your slides. The slide refers to the decision to apply pre-97 indexation to eligible members of the PPF in last week's budget. And the question is, was your slide looking at PPF 7,800 figures and projections post that increase? Was that after applying pre-97 increases for all schemes or just those whose rules gives increases?
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you for the question. That is only schemes who gave increases, who give increases already. So fixed nil or no increases didn't attract any indexation in my sensitivity calculation. And further detail of what I included and not in that calculation can be found below the table of it in Chapter 5 of the Purple Book.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, James. And please do keep those questions coming in. We will ask as many of them as possible. James, I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about data and methodology. Obviously, you had a big revision last year in your methodology. How does the Purple Book's data now differ from that published by the Office for National Statistics and the pensions regulator, and in particular are estimated asset figures comparable there, particularly with the ONS?
Well, as at 31st of March 25, in the same date of Purple, our asset estimate is about 3% different from the ONS's. While we're normally a bit closer than that, maybe about 1% in the recent past, we still think that's within a reasonable sort of margin for difference, given the different methodologies we use. So, like I said before, ours is a roll forward from old data. across all schemes in our estimated universe, whereas the ONS takes a survey sample that it scales up. So there is a difference in methodology there that we expect to lead to differences in the final asset estimate. In terms of the TPR, again, we monitor that, and we speak to each other very regularly. Their figure as at 31st of March, I think is coming up next week in their DB landscape report that they publish. But in terms of the methodology, in terms of the modelling, and how we consider these things, we're always sort of, talking to each other. And before the 31st of March, our figures have been again within a reasonable sort of degree of difference, given the differences between us.
Thank you very much indeed, James. Shalin, can I come over to you? Looking at the legislative changes with regards to the levy, the pension schemes bill is going to remove restrictions preventing the PPF from reducing your annual levy to zero. You've recently announced that you'll charge no conventional levy for 25-26. What happens if those legislative changes aren't sufficiently advanced by April? Do you have a sort of fallback plan then?
Yes, thank you, Jonathan. We do have a fallback plan. I think it's worthwhile just recapping on the reason we need the legislative change. The legislative change is needed because once we move to a zero levy, we're unable to reintroduce a levy. And we do think that having some provision and ability to reintroduce a levy, as much as we would not wish to use that legislative provision, again, as James has pointed out and I've pointed out, we've got 8.6 million members to protect across 5,000 DB schemes for many decades to come. It would be naive of us to suggest that we could predict the future with any certainty, and therefore having that flexibility is important. We've introduced a mechanism which allows us to move to a zero levy, but equally gives us the flexibility to potentially keep that levy at some de minimis amount should the legislative change not come through. That is not our central case. I think things are sufficiently far enough progressed that we have a high degree of confidence that we will be moving to a zero estimate for the levy.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Shalin. We have some more questions here, sort of clarification questions, James, if I may. So one of our questions, one of our audience has asked, could you clarify the slide showing a reduction in protected members from 40 million in 2006 to 8.8 million this year? Is that reduction largely reflecting the buyout trend and the general sort of reduction in DB membership overall?
Absolutely, partly yes. As people buy out and the schemes buy out and members leave the universe, but I suppose with schemes closing and there aren't new members coming in as members pass away, that will also lead to a decline in DB membership. I would say, and some schemes have come to the PPF, but that would only account for about 350,000 of the reduction.
Thank you very much indeed, James. And another question here with regards to the buyout data for 2024, and our questioner sort of asks how this reconciles with the sort of market data out there in general. Where do you get your numbers from for that, and is there a lag on those figures? I think that's the question.
I think you've just answered it in that yes, I think it is a fair question, and is it and we made the same comparison, and it is just because with the scheme return data, ours does have a lag in it. It's part of one of my other jobs. I monitor the pensions press, and every time I see a new buyout or a buy-in, I add it to a list. But when I read that article today or yesterday, I just know it won't show up in my scheme return data for a little while yet.
Thank you very much indeed, James. Very much appreciated. Shalin, can I come to you with a question on surplus sharing and scheme funding? What impact do you expect surplus sharing measures to have on scheme funding, if any, please?
Yeah, I think when we look at the estimates coming and the government's own estimates for surplus sharing and what might be shared with sponsors and therefore leave the DB universe, the numbers at this stage appear quite small. And therefore, it is debatable to what extent the surplus flexibilities will indeed have the intended effect of lots of schemes running on with the view to maximizing the value in the defined benefit pension for the benefit of both members and corporate sponsors. At this stage, it's fair to say the evidence seems to suggest that this will only have a very limited impact. I would also say, were it to have a higher impact, what we notice is, certainly anecdotally, is that most pension funds, having come from an environment where they've experienced high volatility in the funding levels, have adopted a stance of wanting to be fairly well hedged for interest rate and inflation risk, and to consider looking for additional returns in some of the asset classes that could deliver those additional returns with more stability. So you're looking at more contractual income, credit type assets, rather than full-on growth equity. Although some equity will feature, it's fair to say so far it's not a significant part of the equation, and therefore we're not anticipating huge amounts of re-risking in the universe. But again, nor do we see yet that the surplus flexibilities are necessarily going to have as high a take-up rate as might have been initially thought.
Thank you, Shalin. And look at the budget announcement, which will allow well-funded DB schemes to pay surplus funds directly to members over normal retirement age. Could that sort of change the process, perhaps speed it up?
Yes, definitely. I think those flexibilities are very helpful, and we know that the industry has been quite vocal about those changes going a long way to helping schemes implement those surplus flexibilities in a more streamlined way and reducing some of the administrative complexities. I would, however, say that again, I don't expect that to make a significant difference. It's probably at the margins and probably just makes things easier for those who are already intending to take advantage of the flexibilities.
Thank you very much indeed. James, come to you with another question. Please do keep those coming in. We'll get through as many as we can. Can you comment on the trends in leverage since the 2024 Purple Book in the context of fixed income and LDI and so forth?
Well, I'd love to. Unfortunately, the data is perhaps limited and has been. The limitation levels have been different over the years. One thing I will point out is the bond proportion shown is per instructions on how to fill out the scheme return are both physical bonds held and unfunded LDI that behaves like a bond. So there will be an element of that unfunded leverage is included. It's hard to tell whether it's complete and it's got everything in it. The cash figure in the scheme return is not split out between physical cash held and sort of the negative cash that is used to offset how you fill in the bond proportion for the unfunded LDI. So again, it's a level further than what we have, unfortunately. But one thing I have added to the Purple Book 25 in that sensitivity table, I talk about at the end of chapter 5, I have included some sensitivity scenarios where instead of rolling assets forward according to the reference indices, I've thought, well, okay, if you assume a level of hedging and you move hedging assets by that level of hedging relative to what liabilities have done, how does the estimated asset value change? So look at the end of chapter 5 for more on that.
Thank you very much, James. Shalin, I've got perhaps a technical one here. Have you done any analysis of how common it might be for members to be slightly worse off because a scheme offering pre-97 index was slightly greater than 100% funded versus section 179 on insolvency? So I think the question is referring to a scheme that perhaps could have bought out at a level of benefits slightly above PPF compensation that is now slightly being improved.
Yeah, no, unfortunately, we have not done any analysis on that at this stage. As you can imagine, most of the focus has been on just simply producing the numbers on various different bases in order to facilitate that pre-97 indexation. But it's certainly a question we could look into in future data that we release.
Thank you very much indeed. And taking pre-97 again, it's something you spoke about during the presentation. But are there any wider impacts, Shalin, as a result of allowing for pre-97 index in the section 179 measure, do you think?
Well, I think there are going to be some potential unintended consequences as a result of the section 179 liabilities increasing, which clearly has an implication for the wind-up trigger that is set for commercial consolidators. So there's an impact there. Clearly there's an impact for schemes that may have been in assessment looking to buy out or effect a transaction. There's a decision point there. So there are some wider consequences on section on the decision to award pre-97 prospectively. And again, it will impact section 179 valuations, and we are looking to or working with DWP to understand the type of guidance that we could give to scheme actuaries who are seeking guidance on how to complete their section 179s.
Thank you very much indeed, Shalin. We've got a question here. When will the 2025 Purple Book be published? I think mentioned right at the beginning it was out now. Is that correct, James? Or
the buttons are being pushed as soon as this webinar is over, perhaps 11 o'clock. It will take a few minutes because the homepage of Purple has those interactive charts on it, and which you can click through and click your own data to visualize on the graphs, and that can take a few minutes just to load onto the website. But yeah, the process will begin either at the end of this webinar or 11 o'clock, whichever comes first.
Lovely. So thank you for that question. So imminently is where we're at. So thank you very much indeed for that. Well, sort of, I think we're through all the questions we've been asked. So I'm just going to ask sort of final wrapping up question to both James and Shalin. What are the main points you would like people to leave with following this session? James, can I come to you first, please?
Well, I suppose a couple of things. I suppose we flagged at the very start sort of this theme of stability and consistency, and I know I said in the 7-800 since there have been more movements in markets and resulting implications on asset liability values and the overall surplus, but those other core statistics, the proportion of schemes, the bond allocation, that sort of stability, will at least persist over that time period. So I just think that's I think that's sort of the really the interesting thing. And the other thing I'd say is, I talked about it, Shalin mentioned it, we've added new content. We hope people find it flicking through the Purple Book. We hope it's useful. And like I said, please do give us more inspiration and more feedback about what you'd like to see.
Thank you, James. Email yourself if people have those additional suggestions.
Sure.
Contacts in the Purple Book.
Yeah, or Shalin, or PPF mailbox, or your usual PPF contact.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed. Shalin, over to you. Sort of what are your concluding thoughts? What would you like people to leave with?
Yeah, I think if we go back again to reflect on why we started producing the Purple Book, which is, as I've said before, an abbreviated stands for the Pension Universe Risk Profile. It's our lens into the risk faced by the PPF. We've talked about stability and consistency, which is really been driven by the maturity of our defined benefit universe. So the takeaway is we've reached that maturing phase, and we're fast going into the end game. This is a £1 trillion DB industry still to this day, and therefore it is quite important that as we approach the end game, the Purple Book and our view on the risk profile that the universe presents to us evolves to understand the data that will be more relevant to us in the end game, as well as some of the risks that we might face in that end game. Some of those risks are quantifiable, others less so, because there are unknowns, such as, for example, legislative change and the increasing of benefits, such as, for example, the awarding of, of pre-97. And so it's quite important that we at the PPF continue to evolve our lens on that universe's risk profile. We've seen already an increase in the amount of buy-ins taking place, just based on the amount of annuities being held. And again, we continue to maintain a watching brief on just how those endgame strategies are evolving, either through buying, potentially running on with a view to surplus sharing. And so that to us is an important, is an important development in the end game, and important for us to monitor the risk to the PPF. So those are the concluding points I'd like to leave the audience with.
Thank you very much indeed, Shalin. Thank you, James. I'm afraid that's all we have time for in this webinar. Thank you once again to the PPF and to our speakers, Shalin Bhagwan and James Emmott, for taking part. And indeed, thank you for listening in. Please do join us for our next webinar soon. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.